how are you all? I hope you're doing well. So AOC, who is a member of the Democratic Socialists of America, has been oddly silent on the whole situation going on Cuba. So this has been happening since last weekend, the protests in Cuba. The people are out in the street protesting against the communist regime and the oppressive government in Cuba. And AOC, of course, we know she pushes socialism. Again, she is a member of the Democratic Socialists of America, has been silent. Basically, every other politician has come out immediately and shown their support for the people of Cuba, but there are a few politicians, including AOC, who have remained silent. Well, she has finally given a statement on the happenings in Cuba, and it won't surprise you. It's going to sound very similar to the statement that Black Lives Matter, another Marxist communist organization, has made. So I'll read it for you and then show you some of the criticism. The good news is AOC has gotten a lot of backlash from it, but she says, this is her official statement, we are seeing Cubans rise up and protest their rights like never before. We stand in solidarity with them. We condemn the anti-democratic actions led by President Diaz-Canel. The suppression of the media, speech, and protest all are gross violations of civil rights. Okay, we're good up until there. We also name the U.S. Oh, man, there we go. We also name the U.S.'s contribution to Cuban suffering. Our 60-year-old embargo. Last month, once again, the UN voted overwhelmingly to call on the United States to lift its embargo on Cuba. The embargo is absurdly cruel, and like too many other U.S. policies targeting Latin Americans, the cruelty is the point. I outright reject the Biden's administration in defense of the embargo. It is never acceptable for us to use cruelty, blah, 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 blah. Okay, there's a few more words, but you get the gist. That's basically what she said, which is very similar to what BLM came out and said about the Cuban government. Well, if you remember the graph that we looked at yesterday, it is not an issue of, you can have your criticisms of the embargo one way or the other. I'm not sure if it's something that I'm for, but this is not the cause of the people suffering in Cuba. The cause of the people suffering in Cuba is the oppressive communist regime. And when we looked at the graph, you can see that it's not an issue of the government not having money. This is an issue of how they allocate their money. So the majority of their money goes to foreign investments and not to their people for food, medicine, things of that nature to take care of their people. And that is why the people are protesting in Cuba right now. This has nothing to do with the US. And this is typical sort of communist socialist talk. You have, give to me. You know, it is the responsibility of Cuba to take care of its own people. It is not the responsibility of the U.S. to take care of the Cuban people. Now, if you're doing better, can you go in and help the people of Cuba? Absolutely. That's an argument to be had. But it is the responsibility of the government to take care of their own people. And as we saw with yesterday, it is the government who is mismanaging their own money and not taking care of their people. That is where AOC is completely off in this criticism. And I'll read you what Marco Rubio tweeted out. So he says, the U.S. is the largest provider of food to Cuba each year since $275 million in medicine and $3 billion in remittances to relatives. The suffering in Cuba isn't because of the embargo, it's because of socialism always leads to suffering. And that is what AOC doesn't want to admit. They don't want to admit that it's communism. They don't want to admit that it's socialism. They want to blame it on the US because all of a sudden their ideas are going to look really bad. And it is true that communism and socialism always leads to stuff like this. And they'll always point to Norway and the Nordic countries, and the Nordic countries as evidence that socialism works, and it's a great thing. But you will see that the leaders of those countries, all you have to do is a simple Google search and they'll say, we are not socialist countries. It's a completely different system that they have. Some of it might resemble a little bit of socialism, some of their systems, but they do not consider themselves socialist countries at all. The reason BLM wanted to point to the United States because they want to hide the fact that they actually were in support of Fidel Castro. Somebody unearthed this tweet back in 2016 where Black Lives Matter said RIP Fidel Castro. So they supported the communist regime, and by pointing fingers at the US, it can distract you so that you don't see the truth of what is actually going on. There is another article that came out today. This is an opinion piece in Newsweek, and it says the left's disgraceful failure to condemn Cuba's communist dictatorship. I'll just read you the first paragraph. But it says, the Castro and now post-Castro regime in Cuba is a deeply repressive communist dictatorship whose ultimate place in the proverbial ash heap of history cannot arrive soon enough. The retrograde relic of the Cold War era, when it served as a strategically positioned satrapy, the impoverished island nation has barely changed an iota since the fall of the Berlin Wall. The most recent bout of unrest there, spurred by a restive Cuban population yearning for basic freedoms that most of their Latin American neighbors take for granted, is also a harrowing portent of what could someday come if the progressives, in many cases increasingly outright socialist left, gets its way here in the United States. So that's why they don't want to say communist socialist regime, because that's what they are for. And that, though, as you can see, AOC's criticism, just like BLM, of the United States and their responsibility for what is happening is just completely misguided and completely wrong, and they just don't want to admit that their political ideals always lead to stuff like this. Communism never works. Socialism never works. It never has. And we don't want it in the U.S. So that's all I have to say. Anyway, thank you all for watching. See you later. Bye.